That fool won't survive a single storm up here. They'll find him frozen by December.
In October of 1868, at 9,000 feet in the Colorado mountains, Thomas Weaver realized his cabin was about to become a death trap. The nights were already dropping below freezing. Snow was weeks away, and the only thing keeping him alive, his cast-iron stove, had just cracked open like a split skull. Smoke leaked into the room. Heat poured out into the air and vanished into the ceiling. And Thomas knew that once the real cold arrived, this stove would not keep even one room warm, let alone two. Most men would have ridden down the mountain and bought a new stove. Thomas Weaver picked up a hammer and decided to break the old one even more. In the high wilderness of Colorado Territory, 12 miles west of what would one day become Leadville, a solitary mountain man named Thomas Weaver stood in his drafty log cabin on a bitter October morning in 1868, staring at his cast-iron stove with the kind of intensity most men reserved for reading scripture. The stove had a crack running down its left side, a jagged fissure that leaked smoke and wasted heat into the autumn air. Most men would have cursed their luck and waited until spring to replace it. Thomas Weaver was not most men. He saw something in that broken stove that no one else could see, a possibility that would make his neighbors laugh at first, then fall silent when the true cold came. What he was about to do would seem like madness, deliberately making the damage worse, cutting and modifying a perfectly functional stove until it resembled something between a forge and a puzzle. But Thomas had spent 17 winters in these mountains, and he understood something about heat that the valley people never learned. By the time the first heavy snow fell, his cabin would be the warmest dwelling for 30 miles in any direction, and the men who mocked him would be standing at his door, asking how he did it. Thomas Weaver had come to Colorado Territory in 1851, following the whispers of gold and the promise of solitude that only the high country could provide. He had found both, though neither in the quantities he expected. The gold was modest, enough to keep him in supplies and ammunition. The solitude was absolute, sometimes crushing, especially after his wife Sarah died, giving birth to their stillborn son in the brutal winter of 1863. He had buried them both on a south-facing slope where the sun touched the ground even in January, and he had stayed in these mountains because leaving felt like abandoning them. His cabin sat at 9,200 feet elevation, built from lodgepole pine and chinked with moss and clay. It had 2 rooms, a main living space with the stove and his bed, and a smaller back room where he stored his pelts, tools, and the dried meat that kept him alive through the long winters. The problem with mountain cabins, any man who lived above 9,000 feet could tell you, was that heat refused to cooperate. You could burn a cord of wood a week and still wake with frost on your beard. The stove, positioned in the main room, would turn that space into a furnace while the back room stayed cold enough to see your breath. Thomas had tried everything conventional wisdom offered. He left the door between rooms open, but the heat rose straight to the ceiling and escaped through the gaps in the roof. He tried moving the stove closer to the doorway, but that just made both rooms lukewarm instead of one hot and one cold. He hung blankets to trap heat, built reflector walls from river stones, even tried a complicated system of pipes he saw in a mining camp once that did nothing but fill his cabin with smoke. Then came the day the stove cracked. It happened during a cold snap in early October, temperature dropping from 60 degrees to 20 in the span of 4 hours. Thomas had loaded the stove heavy with split pine, trying to bank heat for the night ahead, and the metal, already stressed from years of expansion and contraction, gave way with a sound like a rifle shot. The crack ran from the loading door down the left side, a split about 9 inches long and wide enough to slip a knife blade into. Smoke began seeping out, and the draw weakened. Thomas stood there, working his jaw, calculating the cost of a new stove against his meager savings, weighing whether he could make it through winter with this one limping along. He spent that night lying awake, watching the firelight flicker against the log walls, thinking about heat and metal and the way a blacksmith's forge had multiple openings that all served different purposes. Somewhere around midnight, an idea arrived that was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. What if the crack was not a problem, but an opportunity? What if, instead of trying to keep all the heat contained in one iron box, he deliberately vented some of that heat into the back room, controlled and directed, using the stove's own damaged structure as a starting point? By dawn, he had sketched it out in his mind. It would require cutting the stove, adding metal panels, running a heat channel through the wall, and essentially converting his broken stove into something that had never existed before, at least not in any catalog or foundry he had ever seen. The nearest settlement was a mining camp called Granite Gulch, about 7 miles down the mountain. Thomas rode down 3 days later with his cracked stove loaded on a pack mule, taking it to the only blacksmith within 20 miles, a thick-armed German immigrant named Otto Kruger, who ran a forge out of a 3-sided shed. Otto examined the stove, running his fingers along the crack, and shook his head. A new stove from Denver cost $43 plus freight, he explained. This one was finished, maybe worth $3 for scrap iron. Thomas nodded, then laid out his idea. He wanted Otto to help him cut the stove, add venting panels, fashion a heat box that could be mounted through a cabin wall. Otto stared at him like he had just proposed teaching a mule to read Latin. "You want to make the damage worse," Otto said, his accent thick as cold molasses. "You want to cut up a stove that still mostly works and turn it into some kind of, heating contraption that goes through a wall. Thomas, my friend, the altitude has cooked your brain." Thomas explained the physics as he understood them. Heat rises, yes, but it also radiates outward. A cast-iron stove absorbed heat and released it slowly, thermal mass at work. If you could capture some of that radiant heat before it wasted itself heating the ceiling and channel it horizontally through a wall into an adjacent room, you could heat 2 spaces with the same amount of wood that currently heated one. Otto listened, arms crossed, face skeptical. Other men had gathered, miners and prospectors who spent their days at the forge getting tools repaired, and they listened too. By the time Thomas finished, 2 of them were laughing openly. James Hutchins, a prospector from Missouri who talked too much and thought too little, slapped his knee. "That is the dumbest thing I have heard since Charlie Brennan tried to train a bear to pull a plow. You are going to freeze to death this winter, Weaver, and when we find your body come spring, we will know why." There was more laughter. Even Otto cracked a thin smile. But Thomas did not argue. He simply asked if Otto would do the work for $15 and a quarter side of venison. Otto thought about it, shrugged, and agreed. Crazy or not, a man's money was good, and venison was venison. The work took 6 days. They started by reinforcing the crack with riveted straps, not to seal it, but to control it, preventing the split from spreading further. Then Otto cut into the stove's left side with a cold chisel and hammer, expanding the crack into a deliberate opening about 7 inches tall and 4 inches wide. Thomas had sketched a design for a heat box, essentially a metal chamber that would attach to the stove at this opening and extend outward, capturing the radiant heat from the firebox and directing it through the cabin wall. Otto fabricated this box from sheet iron, creating a rectangular duct with an interior chamber separated by a baffle. The hot air from the stove would enter the first chamber, pass around the baffle which slowed it down and allowed the metal to absorb more heat, then enter the second chamber before exiting into the back room through a grated opening. The critical piece was the wall penetration. Thomas's cabin wall was 8 inches thick, 2 layers of stacked logs with moss chinking between them. The heat box would need to pass through this wall without igniting the wood, which meant creating a fireproof channel. Otto fabricated a sleeve from double-walled tin with a gap filled with sand, an old trick used in mining camps to run stovepipes through wooden walls. This sleeve would be mortared into the wall, and the heat box would slide through it, suspended in the middle of the opening with air gaps on all sides. The final detail was an adjustable damper, a simple pivoting plate inside the heat box that Thomas could open or close to control how much heat diverted into the back room versus staying in the main room. When the work was finished, Thomas loaded the modified stove back onto his mule and headed up the mountain. Behind him, he heard the laughter resume. James Hutchins called out, "See you at the spring thaw, Weaver, assuming the bears do not drag your frozen carcass off first." Thomas did not turn around. He had 16 years of mountain winters in his bones, and he knew something they did not. Conventional wisdom kept men alive, but it rarely kept them comfortable. Innovation, even the kind that looked like foolishness, that was what separated surviving from thriving. Back at his cabin, the real work began. Installing the modified stove was not a matter of simply setting it in place. Thomas needed to cut through his cabin wall, a task that filled him with dread because once he started, there was no going back. If the idea failed, he would have a hole in his wall and winter coming fast. He chose a spot on the wall separating the main room from the back storage room, about 4 feet off the floor and 2 feet left of the existing doorway. Using a handsaw and a froe, he carefully cut through the interior log, then the exterior log, creating a rough rectangular opening about 10 inches tall and 6 inches wide. The logs resisted, the wood tough and resinous, and sawdust mixed with old chinking fell to the floor in small avalanches. He mixed a batch of clay mortar, combining red clay from the creek bed with sand and water until it reached the consistency of thick mud. This mortar would hold the tin sleeve in place and create a fireproof seal. He worked slowly, packing the mortar around the sleeve, smoothing it with his fingers, making sure no gaps remained where sparks could find wood. The work took hours, his hands cramping from the repetitive motion, his back aching from bending over. By the time he finished, afternoon had faded into evening, and the temperature was dropping fast. He needed to let the mortar set overnight, which meant sleeping cold, but there was no rushing this part. A mistake here could burn his cabin down. The next morning, with frost coating the meadow grass and his breath visible in the cabin air, Thomas installed the stove. He positioned it carefully, aligning the heat box with the wall opening, making sure the angles matched. The heat box slid through the sleeve with about an inch of clearance on all sides, exactly as planned. He connected the stove's chimney pipe, loaded the firebox with kindling and split pine, and struck a match. The fire caught quickly, flames licking up around the wood, and Thomas closed the loading door and opened the draft. Smoke rose cleanly up the chimney. So far, everything worked as it should. He watched the stove for an hour, feeding the fire, letting the metal heat up. He could feel the warmth radiating from the stove's surface, the familiar comfort of a good fire on a cold morning. Then he walked into the back room and waited. At first, nothing. The room was cold, untouched by any heat source. He wondered if the whole idea was a failure, if James Hutchins would be proven right. Then, slowly, he began to feel it. A warmth, subtle but undeniable, radiating from the grated opening of the heat box. He held his hand near the grate and felt the heat pouring out, not as hot as standing directly beside the stove, but warm enough to change the air. He smiled, a rare expression for a man who lived alone. Over the next week, Thomas refined the system. He adjusted the damper, learning how much to open it to balance heat between the two rooms. He discovered that partially closing the damper created a slower, steadier heat flow that kept the back room at a comfortable temperature without robbing the main room of warmth. He added a small sheet metal reflector behind the heat box grate, angling it downward to direct more heat toward the floor instead of letting it all rise to the ceiling. He stuffed additional insulation around the wall penetration, using strips of wool blanket to seal tiny gaps where cold air might infiltrate. The system worked better than he had imagined. With the same amount of wood he used to burn before the modification, he could now keep both rooms warm. The main room stayed hot, the stove radiating heat as it always had. The back room, which used to hover just above freezing, now maintained a temperature comfortable enough that Thomas started sleeping there, finding the slightly cooler air easier on his lungs than the main room's sometimes oppressive heat. He moved his bed into the back room, along with his chair and the small table where he repaired traps and cleaned his rifle. The main room became his kitchen and workshop, the back room his living quarters. He kept the innovation to himself, not out of secrecy, but simple isolation. He did not go down to Granite Gulch unless he needed supplies, and when he did not mention the stove. Why give the mockers another reason to laugh? Let them think he froze in his cabin. Let them imagine him huddled under blankets, shivering. He knew the truth, and that was enough. October faded into November. The aspens dropped their gold leaves, and the first serious snows arrived, heavy wet flakes that piled 2 feet deep in a single night. The temperature dropped and stayed down, hovering in the teens during the day, falling below zero at night. This was normal for the high country, the rhythm Thomas had learned over 17 years. What was not normal was how comfortable he felt. While other mountain men burned through their winter wood supplies at an alarming rate, Thomas found himself using less. The heat efficiency of his modified stove meant longer burns, less frequent stoking, and more time to attend to other tasks like checking his trap lines and maintaining his gear. By mid-November, the cold had settled into something serious. Temperatures dropped to 15 below zero, then 20 below. The kind of cold that turns spit to ice before it hit the ground. that made metal burn your skin on contact, that killed livestock and froze water buckets solid in minutes. Down in Granite Gulch, men huddled in their cabins and tents, burning everything they could find, rationing their wood supplies, wondering if they had enough to make it through. Some of the poorer miners, the ones who had arrived late in the season and had not prepared properly, were in real trouble. Thomas heard about it when Otto Kruger came riding up the mountain on a mule, leading a second mule loaded with blacksmithing tools. Otto was making emergency rounds, repairing cracked stoves and broken dampers for men whose heating systems had failed in the cold. He stopped at Thomas's cabin more out of courtesy than necessity, knowing Thomas was experienced enough to handle his own repairs. Thomas invited him inside, poured him coffee that had been staying warm on the stove for 3 hours, and watched Otto's face change. The German blacksmith stood in the main room, feeling the heat, then walked into the back room and stopped. He held his hand over the heat box grate, felt the warmth pouring out, and turned to Thomas with an expression somewhere between disbelief and respect. "It works," Otto said quietly. "That crazy idea of yours, it actually works." Thomas shrugged. He explained the refinements he had made, the damper adjustments, the reflector addition. Otto listened, then asked the question Thomas had been expecting. "Can you do this to other stoves? Can you make this work in different cabins?" Thomas considered. The design depended on having a wall to penetrate, and that wall needed to separate two spaces that both needed heat. Most cabins in the mining camps were single-room affairs, but some of the larger structures, the boarding houses and supply stores, had multiple rooms. "Yes," he said finally, "but it requires a stove with enough radiant heat output, and it requires the wall to be positioned correctly relative to the stove. You cannot just slap this on any setup." Otto nodded slowly. "There are men down in the gulch who would pay good money for this," he said. "James Hutchins, for one. His tent is so cold he is sleeping in the assay office, paying 2 bits a night just to be near someone else's stove." Thomas felt a flicker of satisfaction at that, though he kept his face neutral. "Let him freeze a bit longer," he said. "Maybe it will teach him to keep his mouth shut." But Otto shook his head. "There are families down there, Thomas. Children. A woman with a baby, her husband died in a shaft collapse last month. She is trying to keep that child warm in a cabin with a stove that barely draws. I am worried she will not make it." Thomas's satisfaction evaporated, replaced by something heavier. He remembered Sarah, remembered the stillborn baby, remembered the helplessness of watching someone you loved suffer in the cold. "All right," he said. "Bring her up here. Her and the baby. They can stay in my back room until we figure something out." Otto brought the woman 2 days later. Her name was Margaret Colby, 24 years old, thin from grief and poor eating, with a baby boy named Daniel, who was maybe 4 months old. She arrived wrapped in blankets, the baby pressed against her chest, her face hollow with exhaustion and fear. Thomas gave her the back room, moved his bed back into the main room, and showed her how the heat box worked. She wept when she felt the warmth, not from sadness but from sheer relief, the knowledge that her baby would not freeze. She stayed for 3 days, sleeping in the warm back room, eating the venison stew Thomas cooked, gradually recovering her strength. On the 3rd day, she asked him if he could install one of these systems in her cabin. Thomas rode down to Granite Gulch with Margaret and Otto, bringing tools and materials. Her cabin was small but well-built, a single room with a loft where she kept supplies. Her stove was a smaller model than Thomas's, but it was functional, just poorly positioned in the corner where its heat dissipated uselessly. Thomas studied the layout, calculating angles and distances. He could not do exactly what he had done in his own cabin because there was no second room, but he could build a heat retention box that would capture and hold radiant heat, releasing it slowly over time. It would not be as efficient as his through-wall system, but it would be better than what she had. He worked for 2 days, fabricating a metal heat box that sat beside the stove, connected by a short duct. The box was filled with river stones, which absorbed heat from the stove and released it gradually even after the fire died down. It was a modification of his original idea, adapted to a different situation. When he finished, Margaret's cabin stayed warmer longer, using less wood. She paid him with a silver dollar and a jar of preserved peaches she had been saving, and she told everyone in Granite Gulch what Thomas Weaver had done. The requests came slowly at first, then faster. A boarding house owner wanted a system to heat 3 rooms from one stove. A supply store needed heat in both the shop and the storage room. Two miners who shared a cabin wanted to split the heat evenly instead of fighting over who slept closest to the stove. Thomas worked through November and into December, adapting his design to different situations, learning what worked and what did not. Otto helped with the metalwork, and together they developed a range of modifications, from simple heat retention boxes to complex ducting systems that moved warm air through multiple spaces. James Hutchins, the prospector who had mocked Thomas so loudly back in October, came to him in mid-December. His tent had collapsed under snow weight, and he was living temporarily in a shared cabin with 5 other men, all of them miserable and cold despite burning wood constantly. Hutchins did not apologize directly, but his humility was evident in the way he stood with his hat in his hands, asking quietly if Thomas might help them. Thomas did not gloat or refuse. He simply nodded and went to work, installing a heat distribution system that made the crowded cabin tolerable for all 6 men. Hutchins paid him with $3 and a promise to keep his opinions to himself in the future. By Christmas, Thomas Weaver had modified 14 stoves and heating systems across Granite Gulch and the surrounding camps. He had not set out to become any kind of expert or inventor. He had simply tried to solve his own problem with his own broken stove. But the innovation had spread because it worked, because it answered a real need that mountain people faced every winter. Other blacksmiths began copying his designs, adapting them further, and by the following winter, variations of the Weaver heat box, as people called it, were showing up in mining camps from Colorado to Montana. Thomas returned to his cabin after Christmas, tired but satisfied. His wood supply would last through March easily, maybe into April. The cabin stayed warm without effort, both rooms comfortable. He sat in his chair in the back room on a January night, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling the steady warmth from the heat box grate, and he thought about Sarah and the baby buried on the hillside. He thought about Margaret Colby and her son Daniel, warm now in their cabin. He thought about the way a broken stove, a thing most men would have cursed and discarded, had become something useful, something that helped people survive. The winter of 1868 was remembered as one of the coldest on record in Colorado territory, but it was also the winter that changed how mountain people thought about heating. The innovation was not spectacular or revolutionary in the way a gold strike or a railroad was revolutionary. It was quieter than that, more practical. It simply meant that people slept warmer, burned less wood, and survived the cold a little more comfortably. And for Thomas Weaver, the mountain man who saw possibility in a cracked stove while others saw only failure, it meant something else. It meant that Sarah and the baby had not been the end of his story. It meant that loneliness and loss did not have to define him. It meant that a man could still create something good, even in the broken places. Years later, when younger men asked him about that winter, Thomas would shrug and say it was just common sense, just a matter of paying attention to how heat moves and being willing to try something different. But those who knew him, who remembered the mocking in October and the vindication in December, understood it was more than that. It was about refusing to accept things as they were just because that was how they had always been. It was about seeing problems as opportunities and being willing to look foolish in pursuit of something better. And most of all, it was about the quiet triumph of a man who turned his brokenness into warmth for an entire community, one cracked stove at a time.